of math, let's say. The first section of math will be used to judge the student's sort of broad basic level. And then the next section will be used to refine that score. So that's how it adapts. The first section is basically static. Everyone gets, well, so you get a set of static questions, meaning the questions are not adapting one-to-one. But when you get to that second section, it has now taken into account how you performed on the first and then given you questions appropriate level of difficulty to where that test taker has scored. So that's a pretty big difference in testing, because if somebody is doing really well on the test, and they do really well in that first section, that second section is going to be really hard. Unlike the current SAT, where you're guaranteed a certain number of easy questions, a certain number of medium questions, a certain number of hard questions, on the digital test, that person could just have, almost no easy questions on their entire test. So it'll feel like a different testing experience. Okay, so that's important to sort of recognize that distinction and pay attention to it. Now, the adaptive nature of the test does allow for less time. So I think one thing overall is it's a shorter test. It's 1/3 less time. It's only 2 hours instead of 3. More time per question, shorter reading comp, all of these things you see here are sort of the big structural changes to the test. But overall, the content of the test so far, and I'm going to say so far and put a pin in that, right? Because they haven't released sample questions yet. So they're going from reading passages that were 800 words to reading passages that will probably be 20 words. I don't know if that will be easier or if it will be much more complex 20 words. So it seems like it should be better and easier, but we won't know that until we see actual questions, right? But these are sort of the big announced difference in the test. So, all right, what else do we need to know about? Here are a few things that, so I just took it back a little bit to show you, one of the things that you're going to have to hold on to is just wait for more information, because I don't have, for the cyber SAT, I like to call this cyber SAT because it just sounds fancier. For the cyber SAT, we don't know how much time we're getting per question yet. I do know when they changed the SAT from 2005 to 2016, we got more time per question. College Board has said they're going to give us more time per question, but I don't know quite what that means, right? It's also important to note that I think throughout all of this, especially for current freshmen who are looking at potentially taking that first round of the new SAT, I just would do the ACT. I would not be the guinea pig that first year. There's going to be very little practice material. There's going to be very little, there's going to be less robust information in the first year or so of the test than there will be in later years. So one of the things that I would do if I had a student in 9th grade now, I'm just not going to even bother with the SAT. I'm going to go straight ACT. That way I have a test that hasn't really changed significantly since 1989. And there's a ton of practice material available, right? So things to think about, things to understand, when they're changing the test, we will find out some information. I know the test is getting shorter overall. I know the content areas will roughly be the same. I know the scoring on the SAT will not change, right? But if you're getting a minute a question versus 50 seconds a question, that is somewhat of a different test. So right now, it's hard to say how different the new test will be, right? And that's why, to me, it's a lot of comparisons like different Spider-Man costumes. It's Coke versus Pepsi. It's kind of the same, but not quite really. Because to me, Pepsi is nasty crap and Coke is delicious, right? So depending on the student you have, right, one test may feel better to them than the other. And without available practice material, we won't know that yet, right? The College Board has promised to release practice material, I believe, later this year. So, in 6 months, in 8 months, you'll have a lot more, this webinar will be different and I'll have a lot of these blanks filled in. Right now, I do know that the time is shorter. And one of the things we're talking about the incredibly shrinking SAT, right? From 3 versions ago, the test is now, almost half as short it's going to be from where it was, which is an interesting change. Content areas will probably be the same. So again, if you look at kind of like what's going on between the SAT, the ACT, the old version of the SAT, the current version of the SAT, it's really just the same topics shifted around. What do those percentage breakdowns look like? So what tends to happen with these standardized tests is the changes redistribute how things are tested, right? Are we going to test a lot of geometry or a lot of algebra, right? That's what's going to change more so than is it suddenly an entirely different test, right? I think the biggest change will be the different experience of on computer versus not. So somebody asked a question. I know students do. I think the digital SAT will reuse questions bank. So right now, the similarity between a digital SAT and any SAT has come before. We just don't know. They haven't released any sample questions, so we have nothing to base these on but guesses, right? And so I don't want to guess yet about what they're going to do when I can wait 6 months and let them show me somewhat of what they're going to do. And the problem with anyone who guesses early is that they tend to get things wrong, okay? Because let's say I told you the SAT was going to test functions. If you look at these 3 questions, right, from the ACT and 2 versions of the SAT, they all test functions in a slightly different way, right? They're all testing the same topic, but the spin is different. The way you can handle it is different. The approach to it will feel different. The level of complexity is somewhat different. The wordiness of the redesigned SAT, which is the current form of the SAT, was very surprising to a lot of test takers, right? So it went from a test that had very few words in math to a lot of words in math. So practicing on a different version of the SAT may or may not give you the practice you need for the version you're going to take. So I don't recommend it, okay? Some examples of some things that happened with the last release. The last time they released sample SATs, right, they gave us these questions, this one here, which is, 70 words and really long answer choices and no real math equations, but this was a math question. And a lot of people were freaked out by the level of difficulty that this question suggested. And then there was also this one, which was a grid-in. Again, it looks really difficult, and it probably was, talking about density and mass. Well, when the actual test was released, these were pre-release questions before they had actually administered the official SAT. The pre-release questions, nothing looked this hard when you got to the actual exam. So be very careful about early information that you get from folks, which is why, again, I think that first class of new test takers are the ones who should be most cautious, because a lot of test prep companies are going to jump the gun and start doing a lot of work with early stuff, right? And the early stuff may or may not hit the actual mark. So if I had the choice, I would generally avoid the SAT while there's still a lot of unknowns. That new digital SAT, right? If you're in 10th grade, 11th grade now, you just got to take the old SAT, then you're just fine. Okay. So here's what the timing of that looks like, right? So College Board is essentially what they're going to do is they're going to roll out the PSAT in the fall, right? And then roll out the SAT in the spring. So the fall of 2023, international sites will give the PSAT. And then in the spring of 2024, domestic sites will give the PSAT, right? So they'll start rolling it out with fall fall PSATs, and then they're going to roll it into SATs. I ignore the spring PSAT, which doesn't mean anything to nobody. Nobody cares. But really what you're looking at is a March, if you're domestic, of 2024 for your SAT. And March of 2023 if you're international for that first digital SAT. Okay. All right, what else do we need to know? So you have to think about kind of what that schedule looks like, right? What does your prep schedule look like if you're going to prep for it? Like most people, most juniors these days, right, are starting to prep in the spring, the winter to spring of their junior year for a March test, maybe a May test. Right? And then they do a second test, ideally somewhere in August, something like that. So they have plenty of time if they need to take one of those fall tests in their senior year before applications, right? So this shouldn't change for most people, right? The only thing that's really going to change is if you're thinking about one of those tests down the road and you don't have the option to do an ACT, what would my prep schedule look like, and how long do I have to wait before I start to engage in prep if I'm forced to take that first year or so, or those first 3, of the digital SAT. Right. So that's kind of the changes that are known right now, right? We know that in the US, the first digital SAT will be in the spring of 2024. We know that currently, we know it's going to be on computer, it's going to be adaptive, it's going to be 2 hours, right? Other than that, it will largely be the same as the current test, although there will be some stylistic differences, just like getting a burger from McDonald's versus Burger King. They're all burgers, but they are somewhat different, right? So we have to kind of figure out what that's going to happen. Within the context of the test changing, we also have test optional, right? Which is another big part of this conversation. And so I just want to throw out a couple of points, right? One, what does test optional mean, right? It means generally 2 things. One, test free, in that they won't look at scores at all. There's about 65 colleges that are doing that right now. University of California, most California public school systems aren't looking at the test at all, right? Both the Cal State system and the University of California. Whereas on the other hand, you have places like Georgia and Florida, where all their public institutions are requiring the test. So whether the test is optional or not for you largely depends on the institutions to which you are applying. So it's really important right now, as you're thinking about applying to college, and this is important for especially juniors and the juniors right now, and maybe the sophomores starting to think about whether I'm going to take the test, whether I need to prep for the test. You have to think about the institutions you're applying to. If your goal is only to apply to the University of California, if that's the plan, then you don't need to take the test at all. But if your plan is to apply to other places, if your plan is to apply to public universities in Florida or in Georgia, you might need to take, you will need to take the test in Florida or Georgia. In other places, it's going to be an option that the schools will give you. And things to be careful about when you hear test optional. And at the bottom of the page is a website where you can find the full list of test optional schools. But one of the things to be careful about when you're talking about test optional is optional for admissions doesn't always mean optional for everything. Sometimes places are optional for admissions, but require testing for scholarships or class placement or certain majors or honors programs. So make sure you ask. I actually recommend that everybody just put together a grid like this when they're thinking about applying to college. So this is somebody, let's say, who's coming out of Texas. So they're largely looking at Texas schools, right? St. Mary's University is entirely test-free, not only for admissions, but also for their merit scholarships. Whereas if you look at Tarleton, right, they're optional for admissions, but they require the test for scholarships. And don't take my chart here as the gospel. I think I put this together a year ago, and it might be entirely different right now. So part of what you're paying attention to is, what are the policies at the institutions that I'm interested in? And that's really what's going to start to govern what's going on. And largely, juniors are not going to know what institutions they're applying to. So one of the things that sort of happens right now, especially, is unless you're in somewhere like California and pretty sure that you'll never need the test, then most people probably need to prep in case they need to test. And so what I always advise families is, what they're thinking about is 3 basic questions. What test am I taking, and should I prep for it? After I've taken the test, I can decide whether to send my scores or not, right? So there's really 3 different things. Let me say it a little bit more clearly. Should I prep? Should I test? And should I send my scores? Those are 3 questions that you can separate because you have to answer them at different times. Should I prep? You have to decide on early, right? If you're going to take the test in March of the junior year, you have to decide in November, or October, whether you're going to prep and how you're going to prep, right? But you don't have to decide whether to send your scores or not until you see those scores in April or May, whenever they come back, right? So you can stagger those decisions till when you reach sort of that deadline point and just make it the 3 different questions you're answering. Should I prep? Should I take the test? Should I send the scores, right? Other things to be careful about test optional is, I see a lot of companies that are putting out that are putting out data around test optional admissions. Be very careful about people who put out charts like this, the percentage of those who are admitted with scores or without, because they actually don't mean very much. If you don't know the GPA of the people with the scores versus without, then how do we know what actually caused the admissions decisions? And even GPA wouldn't be enough to fully tell that story. So I think things we want to think about is, like, sure, having the data of, are they getting in more with scores or not is seemingly helpful. It kind of looks like you have a better chance with scores with Georgia Tech, but I actually don't know if that's true. It could just be that the students applying to Georgia Tech all the ones with the best grades already took the test, and those are the ones who applied with test scores versus the ones with lower grades chose to exclude their scores. We don't know that without having a full data set. So just be careful about the information you're seeing out there around test scores, about the percentages like this, because they don't mean very much. Right. And that information, like, and some colleges are more clear about or share more data than others. I love the University of Illinois. They put out a whole book on who enrolled. One of the things I found fascinating about this chart, if we just look at the SAT middle 54-minute, right? See how much it varies across colleges, right? The one sort of at the highest one there, the engineering college, obviously has the highest test scores, right? Look at the range of scores for the engineering college versus FAAA. I don't even know what FAAA is, right? And I'm sure if I chose to read the rest of the enrollment report, I could find that out. But I think what's really interesting here is that the range of scores of admitted students vary greatly, right? So be careful around averages that you're going to see published online, because they may not mean much. Like if you look at the middle average just on their chart, right? This shows a middle average of 1410. But if the mid range of FAA, is really around 1300. So that's a very big difference from what I'm looking at when I see a 1410 average. So averages are bad, ranges are a little bit better, but just keep in mind those things never quite tell the full story, right? All right, other things to pay attention to. We can see that data in lots of different ways. I'm going to just jump past all of this. Be careful of those scatter plots, because especially with test optional, those scatter plots start to be less. This is the scattergram for University of Michigan at a high school. And one of the things sort of intrigued me, this was in SCORE for you guys who use SCORE. Naviance is sort of the same type of program. But when I looked at Michigan State, right, it says their average is 1210. But when I pulled up their CDS, which is the common data set, it actually shows the full distribution of their scores. Well, it looks like basically anybody above 1,000 gets in, right? Almost everyone who enrolls in their schools scores above 1,000. So that 1210 is slightly misleading, right? It looks like basically they like students above 1,000. If I have above 1,000, I have a good chance of getting in, right? So again, be careful about these numbers. Be careful about these single data points, because they often don't tell the full story, right? And so you want to start taking a deeper dive into these things and answering those questions a little, asking those questions a little bit more deeply. If one of the things I actually liked was Jen, the tutor, she put together these 15 questions that you could ask college admissions office. Now, obviously, you don't want to ask all of them in one shot, but some ways to think about test optional admissions and testing that might give a better picture of how the school uses them. At what stage are SAT scores used? Some places might say they use it first round to make an initial cut. Other places might say, well, we only use it if we're uncertain of something or another. Okay. And so there's all of these questions that will help you refine your thinking around test optional admissions and whether you're going to submit your scores or not. Right. Not every college that is test optional considers submitted scores in the same way. Some of those colleges will, if you choose to go test optional, they have two separate rounds of consideration. They have the people who did submit scores and the people who did. Other schools are more holistic, and they say, whatever you send me, if you have APs, send them, we'll look at them. Some people have APs, some people won't. Some people will have tests, some people won't. And they just say, we'll take everything in. We're not separating and putting it into score pile and not, and we just look holistically at the application, right? So different schools look at scores in different ways. So just keep that in mind and ask some questions, try to dig into what's going on. Some colleges have really good transparency. Queens College is one of my favorites. Adrian is the admissions officer there, and I love her. They actually just posted on their website a rubric, not only a clear distinction of what they do with test scores, they actually posted a rubric for their essay, which I thought was really interesting. It's the only place I've ever seen it. So some colleges are really transparent around how they're using this information as they admit students. So the more you can dig into it and find that information, I think the easier this process will become. And your goal is to try to make this as kind of normal as possible and as uncrazy as possible. And in the end, colleges will get profiles, and whether there are scores or not, they'll be able to make distinctions. When I look at profiles like this, not very many people are going to change their mind about who to admit and who not to, simply because you saw a test score in there. The vast majority of students have test scores that are aligned with, with their with their GPAs. So it doesn't often add a whole lot of information that otherwise isn't already available. With the digital SAT, they've promised to have accommodations for students who qualify for accommodations. One thing to be careful about is a 504 or an IEP in school is not the same as accommodations for the SAT or the ACT. SAT and ACT are essentially private companies that you have to apply to in order to get accommodations. So start that process very early, right? As soon as you possibly can, and try to get those accommodations on record before, with the SAT, you can actually do it before you sign up for the test. With the ACT, you have to sign up for the test first. So just make sure you do it early, because SAT, you could have a 504 in school and the SAT deny you for accommodations on the test. You can get accommodations from the SAT and not get them from the ACT. So just make sure you do that early and get that out of the way as soon as possible so that you're not surprised by what happens. In the long run, I think the thing that we have to keep in mind is that the SAT is not going anywhere, right? It's going to be around in some way, shape, or form for the foreseeable future. Its importance will probably be reduced. The form it takes will change, but it will still be there. So you have to think about, if I want to hedge my bets, it's probably better to have a score and not need it than to need a score and not have it. So unless I have a student that absolutely hates testing and the thought of test prep, I'm probably going to have my student prep right now, right? In this world right now. Even though 80% of colleges are test optional, I would rather have done the prep and find out, if you don't do the prep, you won't know whether your child is able to get to that 1,500, 1,600, whatever, right? 1,600, I'm sending my score everywhere, right? If my child, does a little work and can't get, I don't know, a 700, then yeah, we're just going to let the test go and not bother with it, right? So part of the nice thing about optional right now is you have the option to figure out what your child's strengths are and to play towards their strengths. If they're a good test taker and putting in their best effort, they can get a good score. That might be useful, because there still are some things that are tied to test scores, and there will be some things that are tied to test scores in the future. All right, so I'm going to jump into the Q&A and make sure that we've handled all of these questions. Do you think the online version would change anything about how I would take? The online version is definitely going to change how people take the SAT. Just think about Zoom versus classroom, right? It is a different experience reading on a computer, trying to do math on scrap paper while you got the problem on a computer in front of you. Like, all of that stuff is different, right? So the experience of test taking is different. And for some students, it's going to be a problem. For other students, they'll shrug their shoulders and they don't care about the difference, right? So I think that's going to be one of the things that's going to be significantly different. So again, I think the issue is prepping for it, understanding what it is, and understanding what you can do to get your best possible result. I'm going to jump past this so we can get to some questions. If you have any questions, put them in the thingy, right? Prep. Like, I don't want to go into kind of what all the test prep stuff is about, right? But you guys should understand that one of the things that you want to understand about all of this is that any test that you can take, you can prep for. And the more prepared you are for the test, the more likely you are to do better. Tests like the SAT and the ACT, which have quirks and nuances to them, really benefit from prep, because a lot of the prep, or some of the prep, is circled around the specific nuances and gamesmanship of taking that test, right? And that is not necessarily something that is taught in school. So that's where specialized prep starts to have an advantage on tests like this. With all of that said, questions that we haven't gotten to yet?
We have a couple, Akil. So someone wants to know, how different do you think the new SAT will be from the ACT, and will it make a huge difference to do SAT prep if the student is only going to take the ACT? So does the prep matter?
Yes. If you fix your mouth up for a McDonald's Big Mac and somebody brings you a Whopper, how's that going to go for you? Right? No one wants that. No one wants to prepare for one thing. Like, it's kind of the same, but it's not the same, right? Don't bring me a Whopper if I ask for a Big Mac. We're going to fight, right? Because it's not quite the same. It's hard to wrap your head around the different thing. So also, More specifically, things like the ACT currently has about 30% geometry. The SAT currently has about 6% geometry. So if you put all your time and effort into geometry and you go, into the SAT, you're going to miss a lot of SAT content. So the tests are different. How much a role that difference will play will vary by student, but they're very different, and they're different in bizarre ways that I would not prep for a test that I wasn't planning to take if I had any other option.
And as far as places that are having the digital tests now, like pilot locations, can people choose to be in one of the digital pilots?
I don't think so. From what I've heard, and this is rumor and schools counselors mailing me the invitation they got, it sounds like College Board has sent out emails to various schools, a lot of them international, and invited them to be in the pilot. Now, the thing to be careful about with the pilot, from what I've seen so far, you don't get scores out of the pilot. So you might sign your child up to take the pilot digital SAT this coming spring. You won't have scores reported back to you. So you'll just take a test and give College Board data and not even know how your child did. So make sure if you're signing up for a pilot that you understand what you're signing up for. Personally, I would never sign up for a test. I would never sign up to take a test if I'm not going to get my scores back. And I probably want the questions back too, because what value is the test to you if you can't learn from it? So be careful about those pilots that they're currently doing. From what I'm seeing, they're offering students like $20 to sit for the 2-hour test and not get their scores back.
Wow.
Yeah.
A student is asking, if you're approved for extra time in the digital test, do you think that they're going to give the same breaks and extended time like they are giving now, or do we not have any indication on that?
I would bet it would be similar, parallel in some way. The timing is different, so that's going to play out differently. Also, how breaks are distributed on a digital exam is also going to be slightly different. So I would imagine if you qualify for extra breaks, you'll get extra breaks. I just don't know how they would be distributed. Right? Is there more fatigue from reading on screen than reading on paper? And do they have to give you more breaks because it's digital, or do they give you less because it's shorter? I have no idea yet.
Okay. How is the digital test going to affect the scoring curve? The pilot
knows.
Not scored, so it's not going to affect the curve. But is the digital test going to? Do you think it's going to use previous data? Is it going to have its own data set?
It can't use previous data because the number of questions is going to be different, right? It's a third less time, so I'm imagining it's going to be somewhere around a third less questions, right? So also the notion of a curve is a little bit off, right? Like they have their score scales and they're tight-ish. I would imagine that they're, that we won't know. Let me just say the easiest answer is just wait. Like, don't try to predict the score scale. Don't try to predict none of that. There's just not enough information available yet. And there's no reason to guess at it when even if we knew the curve right now, even if we knew the conversion right now, there's nothing you can do with that information.
Okay. Here's a big one. Is there a benefit, Akil, to starting to study in the 7th
God,
or 8th?
no, please, no. Let's not that. No. Yeah. 7th, 8th grade, stop. Let your child go to school. Do not mention the word SAT or ACT to the child. No middle schooler. I'm going to report to, the Department of Child Welfare, any parent who has their 7th or 8th grader prepping for the SAT. Have your child prepare for school. Have your child learn fun, interesting things. Sure, have them read or do math if that makes them happy. Join their robotics club. Do not prep for the SAT. In theory, a student who's doing well in school only needs to prep to learn the nuances of the test itself, right? In theory, all the content of the exam is learned skills over multiple years. The short-term test-specific skills shouldn't take that long. So if your child is doing well in school and has learned all their algebra, all their geometry, all of that sort of stuff, the test prep nonsense, I could teach them in 3-4 weeks. So anybody who is doing years of prep should be doing academic prep. They might call it SAT prep, but they're not, because there's no way the things that are on the SAT that are SAT specific would require me years to teach a child.
Mhm.
And if a
The-
test prep person is telling you to do that, they're just trying to take your money.
yeah, well, and isn't reading the most important thing, Akil? Like so many of the students that are underperforming on the test can't access the questions quickly enough to be able to get a high score. What would you say about reading? Sonia
I
has
mean,
put in that we need reading.
reading is a huge component of kind of everything you do, right? I think the tests require a particular type of reading. You know, the tests I actually think punish the thoughtful readers, the people who spent all their time in literature class interpreting what bright white light means, right? The test actually punishes that type of reading, the sort of deep, thoughtful, interpretive reader. So yes, the test requires reading. It requires verbal acuity and flexibility and ability to understand words, but it also requires you to know the sort of weird, narrow, pedantic way it wants you to interpret words.
Mm.
So I think fixing all of those skills are important.
One of the parents asked, "How do we know that the software won't crash?" Do you want to talk to us a little bit about the
They are
crash?
using the new SAT digital SAT software is based on the exact same platform that ran the AP software and led to a $500 million lawsuit because it crashed and it was so terrible. I'm imagining they're fixed it or will have it fixed by next year. So they also have said that they've put something in the software that if it does crash, and actually they won't admit to crash, they say if your battery dies, because you know it's always the student's fault, it's not College Ball's fault. If the battery dies, you can log back in and pick up from right where you left off. So apparently they've been thinking about it and tried to solve for if the test goes down in the middle of the test, can you pick back up where you were? And apparently for the digital test, that's supposed to be possible.
What about vocabulary? Should students be asked to memorize words?
No, I'm sorry, let me say that better. As of right now, there are no indications that we're going to go back to 3 versions ago when vocab was highly tested.
Okay. And another parent is asking, so public school systems are not always up to par, so students are not getting the content that they need. If you're in a school system and and your school system is underperforming, should students start earlier to build some of these skills?
I mean, I would think that has nothing to do with the SAT. If you're saying that, you know, your child's in 10th grade and hasn't done algebra, that has nothing to do with the SAT, right? Like colleges want algebra. If you're on track to go to college, you probably want that child to have taken algebra. So my concern is about what are the academic things I want my child to be able to do on their way to 12th grade. And I want to make sure that all of those things are getting done. Um, Whether or not that has anything to do with, and that has nothing to do with the SAT for me. You know, like in my head, my child should be able to do algebra, right? I don't know that I care that they do pre-calculus unless they're on like a STEM track, but I care that they can do basic algebra. I care that probably algebra 2, maybe some geometry, you know? So I'm thinking about what are the skills I want my child to have, and are those skills being developed well? I don't care if my school never teaches another year of US history. I'm real good with world history, sure, because history is history. Like, I don't need that to happen. So I think what you're really considering is what are the skills that are necessary? Are those skills being developed? And if they are being developed, then great, let's develop them further. If they're not being developed, then I do need to supplement that.
So we have some parents online from New Hampshire that are saying that their state is using the school day digital test already, and they're saying that there have been issues already with the school day digital test. So they may still be working on it, but it's not working fluidly just yet.
How surprising. Like, we all saw AP in 2020. It was a big disaster.
Yeah.
With the parent from New Hampshire, I'd love to connect with you and find out what they're doing. I hadn't heard of any states widely doing the newly announced digital tests. All the pilots I've heard of have been out of the country. So I'd be
Well,
really curious to hear how that's going.
they mentioned in the chat that it's not the new test, it's a digital
Okay,
version of the current exam. So
that's irrelevant. Let me say that differently. The digital test will be entirely different, scored differently, different length, in theory, different question types. than what you're doing now. What you're doing now is what they've been playing with a little while is the current SAT just on a computer screen. They're not going to do that anymore. The digital test will be scored differently. It's a whole different ballgame.
And so that brings one of the parents is asking, can you revisit the idea of adaptive testing? Because the parent is wondering, based on the answers that a student gives, the student will get different questions. So this really means that students aren't going to be taking the same test overall.
Correct. In theory, this is a better test for college boarding because it'll minimize cheating. In theory, every kid gets a different test. So yeah, it's in theory a better way to administer an admissions test, or to administer a test with security and specificity personalized for an individual student. That's the theory behind, adaptive testing. That's also part of the rationale behind it being shorter, because it's more personalized. They need fewer questions to determine the student's level of ability.
So there's a question. We understand that the SATs are going digital. What's happening in the ACT world?
Nothing. ACT prides themselves on staying the course, which is actually why I recommend for anybody who's looking at testing in 2024 in the US or 2023 internationally to just take the ACT. One of my favorite things in all the world was during the last change, ACT actually posted a website that was like, what is it, like consistent without the need for radical change. They actually came at College Board and it was like, yeah, we ain't changing our tests. Our test is good like it is. So ACT stays the course. So you can use 5-year-old practice stuff for the ACT. There is no practice material for the digital SAT. Any test prep company who tells you they have practice stuff for the digital SAT at this moment, never talk to them again, because they are lying. College Board has not released any sample questions. They've not released even a description of the test yet, a description of the content of the test.
So here's a question from a family. So we found this sometimes as well, Akil. She says that she has a child on a high math track. They're taking algebra 2 already in the 9th grade, already done geometry and algebra. Sometimes we have found that students that are on an advanced math track, it's not that they don't know the math on the test, they have forgotten the math on the test. What would you recommend for someone who is highly advanced in their math classes?
Do test prep when you get close to the test. Like, especially for a student that is mostly just forgotten the test, right? Who are on, like, I actually tell students all the time, I can't do calculus. I can't do pre-cal. I'm still an SAT tutor. I have a student right now who's in calculus, and we laugh all the time because she knows more math than me. If we look at calculus as being smart, she knows more math than me. I can get every question right on the SAT and the ACT. Because in large part, because my knowledge is hyper specific to the test. So if we're talking about preparing for these tests, they need to make their knowledge base hyper specific to the test. It doesn't matter how smart they are. It doesn't matter if they can do rocket science. It only matters that they know what a prime number is and things that are going to show up in the SAT that they might not have encountered since 6th grade.
And another family is asking, should your child plan to take both of the tests, or should you just aim for one or the other?
I would say take one test only. The goal should be to take either the SAT or the ACT. Colleges don't care which one you take. So you take, don't torture your children unnecessarily. I want them to take a practice test of each early on, right? Decide which one they're going to prep for that one, take it, maybe take it twice, and then call it a day. And hopefully this is all done with. You don't really want to sit there testing and testing and testing forever. Ideally, you prep, you take the test, you get the score you want, you move on with your life. That would be the perfect world. But no one needs to take both tests.
Is it important or beneficial for a sophomore to take the spring PSAT if they have the chance to do it?
Nope. It's a practice for a practice test where the scores go nowhere. The 10th grade PSAT can't even be used for any scholarships that I know of or anything like that. Even the 11th grade PSAT, only if you score in the top 1% in your region do you even have a chance for that $2,500 National Merit Scholarship, which ain't worth much. So for most people, the PSAT doesn't mean much. The 10th grade PSAT certainly doesn't mean anything. Rather than spend time on a 10th grade PSAT, I would download a practice test from off the internet and just do it at home. You get your scores back faster.
All right, so we have run through the Q&A. If you have a question, we have a few more minutes before we wrap up at 7 o'clock. But if there's If there's a burning question that you have, please get it in the Q&A. We're so excited to have Akil with us to be able to give some of these really honest answers to questions about things that you need to know about the SAT and standardized test preparation.
I saw
What about
somebody float a question about the digital ACT. The ACT is digital internationally, and it's on computer internationally. Domestically, it is not on computer. They talked about putting it on computer, then they decided not to.
Got it. What about athletes? Is it possible that athletes need to take the test in their sophomore year?
Athletes are a little bit tougher because they're on a different like a recruited athlete. Let's also be clear about that. If we're talking about a recruited athlete, like if your kid just played basketball and no coach ain't looking at him, then who cares what he does? But recruited athletes are often on a different calendar than other students because the coaches want to be able to say whether you're admissible earlier. So I don't know if they need to take it in 10th grade. And I think that would vary by sport, but I would think that you're probably on an earlier timeline than non-recruited athletes.
Yeah.
So I would definitely talk to a coach about that.
Yeah, in general, what we find is that if coaches want scores in a specific time frame, they're going to ask for those scores. So
Yep.
we do have 10th graders now who are preparing to take the SAT, but they, to your point, are on a national level on their sport and they're being recruited for that. So
right.
Anybody else? We probably got time for 2 more. Please take advantage of the fact that we have Akil with us tonight. We're glad that you are here. Is one test more intuitive than the other? This parent has heard that students do better on the ACT. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, nah. I don't think either of them are intuitive. Some students do better on one than another. I don't believe in any of those things that test prep companies tend to put out there about who does better on one than the other. It's easy enough to take a practice test of each in your home currently, right? Not talking about the digital test, talking about both current tests. You can take a practice test of each at home and just compare them and find out which score is better. Just look up a concordance chart, find out which one is better, and then you know, and you don't have to guess at it. So there is no useful generalization about which test is better for students. The only real answer is to have them do a practice test of each. Or you could use a PSAT and then take an ACT and compare it to that if you already have PSAT scores. The PSAT is essentially the same as the SAT.
Got it. And our last question, Akil, can you study for the ACT or the SAT on your own with books or Khan Academy? Or does it go better if you're working with a test prep organization or a testing center?
You can always prepare on your own. I would change that question and flip it this way. Like, can you learn algebra on your own with Khan Academy? You absolutely can, but you still go to algebra class because most of us find it easier to have instruction. So yes, you can do it on your own. I would also consider that on my own, I'm probably going to need more time than I would with expert instruction. Just think about any of the things you've learned today listening to me and or Keith, right? We have years of experience that would make it so much faster, easier, and shorter for you to prepare. Could you find it out on your own? Absolutely, right? So I'm not saying you have to do something, you have to pay for prep, but I'm saying that, yes, hiring somebody who knows what they're doing will almost always save you time. It's the reason I go to a mechanic and don't try to fix my car on my own.
So we have somebody
do it with YouTube.
Yeah, there we go. We have somebody in the chat that this was a wonderful, informative presentation, and now they're going to choose whether they're going out for a Big Mac or a Whopper. So you've done some promotion for fast food tonight as well.
Good. Remember, Coke is better than Pepsi. McDonald's fries are good. Burger King's fries are nasty, but the Whopper is actually tastier than the Big Mac.
Yeah. Someone said, how far ahead of time do you have to contact the test prep organization? You may want to keep in mind that if you want your selection of who you're working with, you probably want to reach out and start having preliminary conversations to make sure that you have an agency that's going to be a good fit for you. If somebody is available year round, they probably are available for a reason. That's just something that you may want to keep in mind. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Akil. Thanks to all of you that are here. We appreciate you being here. You see that Akil has his contact information on the screen. If you have questions, you may want to check him out at that email address. You may also want to check him out on Facebook Live. He is going to be doing a presentation on March the 3rd about getting in with Akil and friends. Notice that the president and CEO of the Common Application will be there. He's going to have a college counselor and even a student talking about it. You may also want to follow him on Twitter, where you'll get some of the latest information in the funny and creative way that Akil likes to share information with the audience. So we want to thank you for being here. We're going to also put up one final slide for you to take a look at. If you would like to be aware of when we are doing other information sessions like this, this is the social media information for College Thoughts. If you follow us on social media, that would be great. If you scan the QR code, it's going to give you a survey that you can fill out to tell us what you thought of this evening's presentation and other information that you would like to receive in the future. We're happy to set up these webinars and to bring in guests who can give you cutting edge information. We just need to know exactly what you would like to know. Akil, the final question. Some of the folks that are here want to know, how can they get a hold of these slides? Are you going to let them have the slide deck? Is that possible?
Didn't you record it?
We did. We did.
I will also send you a PDF so you can distribute as you see fit.
So we will send out the slides as a PDF to those that were in attendance. There's also a recording. If you reach out to us, we'd be happy to follow the recording. We're going to send you an email after the presentation with some information about how you can follow up with College Thoughts. If you would like more information about how your family might be able to receive assistance from our organization or from organizations like us. But we want to thank you for being here tonight. Again, Akil, you have our appreciation. And we look forward to being in touch with all of you soon. Somebody is raising their hand. Can you put in the chat, or were you just raising your hand to say hi? Okay. All right. So without any further ado, thank you again. Everybody have a great night, and we look forward to being in touch with you soon.